Welcome to In the Know with the Stafford SO, a podcast presented by the Stafford County Sheriff's Office in Virginia that brings you the stories of the men and women who work tirelessly to keep our community safe each day. With In the Know with the Stafford SO, you'll find out what life is really like behind the law enforcement badge. Thank you for listening and thank you for your support.
Hello and welcome to In the Know with the Stafford SO. I'm Kathy Volbrecht, your host for today. Thank you for tuning in. Today's podcast is the first in a series that we're going to do on training here at the Stafford County Sheriff's Office. And my guest today is Sergeant Derek Fedoroff. Sergeant Fedoroff began his law enforcement career with Stafford County in December of 2012. He served as a patrol deputy from 2013 until 2018. In 2018, he transferred to the training section of the Professional Standards Division. In addition to his primary duties as the training sergeant, Sergeant Fedoroff is the simulator coordinator for the Vertra V300 Use of Force Simulator. He is also the range master for the agency and the assistant team leader for the SWAT team. Sergeant Fedoroff is also the lead instructor for firearms and officer survival at the Rappahannock Regional Criminal Justice Academy. So Sergeant Fedoroff, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. And you have a very impressive background.
Thank you.
Now, as I mentioned, this is our first in a series of podcasts on training here at the Stafford Sheriff's Office, and we are going to focus on our use of force training. Now, we know that use of force has been part of the national conversation in recent months on social issues, and we thought it would be helpful to really drill down into what goes into the training for our deputies and to discuss some of the factors that they have to take into consideration, many times having just a few seconds to make that decision in a critical situation. But the first thing I wanted to do is talk real quick about how our deputies are hired, because I think it's important for our viewers to know that our candidates are thoroughly vetted. They go through a rigorous application process, which includes a polygraph and interviews by a selection panel. So Sergeant Fedoroff, why do you think that type of selection process is so important?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I mean, when we come to law enforcement, you can't have a good cop without starting with a base somewhere. And I think it's important to note, first of all, that every law enforcement officer out there is still a human, and none of us are perfect. But at the same time, this job, there's a huge amount of responsibility in this job, and that responsibility shouldn't be taken lightly, and it shouldn't be given lightly either. This job is one of the few in the country or anywhere that our actions have the possibility of having immediate consequences to somebody's freedoms and potentially people's lives. And so it's very important that we find applicants and individuals that are able to make good decisions immediately and that kind of thing. And a lot of the things that we do as law enforcement officers are trainable. The skills and everything are trainable, but it's very important that we start with a good base, and integrity and the ability to make decisions are character qualities that sometimes cannot be trained. So I think first and foremost, we have to start with those qualities, and that's why the hiring process is so stringent.
And once you find those individuals with that basic, strong character foundation, then they are selected to attend the academy that we had mentioned earlier. It's a 20-week academy. Can you talk about, real briefly, what are some of the topics that they are learning about while they're there?
It's a very comprehensive academy, and it goes into a lot of things that most people probably wouldn't even think are covered. We're law enforcement officers, we're not lawyers, but at the same time, they have to go through constitutional law, criminal law, traffic law. There's a large block of law issues that they have to learn, as well as skill-based things that law enforcement officers need to know, whether it's, driving or firearms or control techniques, how to respond to calls, how to do investigations, interpersonal communications, how to talk to people appropriately. And so there's a lot that goes into it. And when we talk about use of force, what this is all about. The use of force block of instruction at the academy is only 8 hours. Out of that 20 weeks, there's only 8 hours that are strictly labeled use of force. However, there's multiple other classes throughout the academy that cover use of force related topics. For example, they spend about 30 hours strictly dealing with mental health subjects, and another 18 or 20 hours talking about verbal de-escalation and interpersonal communications and things. So there's a lot of overlap in the academy. That while on the face of it, if you were to look at the academy schedule and say they only receive 8 hours of use of force training, there's a lot of other classes that kind of overlap with that.
Right. And then once they go through those classes at the academy, we just don't throw them out there on their own. They have field training with other officers who have been on the job for quite some time. Can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So the field training period, they are one-on-one with a senior law enforcement officer in a car with them, responding to calls. And there's different phases. At the beginning, they're more kind of observing the senior officer for the first 3 or 4 days, and then slowly we put them into the more primary role, ending up with them essentially doing everything, and the senior law enforcement officer just observing them. So the state requires that they spend 100 hours in field training. The Stafford Sheriff's Office, we exceed that. We do close to 400 hours. So they spend 10 weeks in field training.
Okay. Now let's talk about use of force training specifically. You had mentioned a few things earlier when you were talking about what the kind of training that they go through at the academy. You mentioned that they also have use of force training throughout the year. What other topics does use of force training cover for our deputies? What other areas do they get into?
Like I said earlier, there's a lot of legal aspects.
Right.
So they cover kind of the legal aspects of it. They cover, how to actually employ force. So if force is required, they develop those skills to be able to use force appropriately and effectively. They also learn how to not use force, how to de-escalate situations and avoid using force. And a lot of that is through scenario-based training and things like that. That's the best way to learn how to make decisions, is by being put into those situations in the first place.
I was going to ask you about that, the type of training that our deputies receive when it comes to actual use of force. So we know they go through the training at the academy. We know they're doing the field training when they graduate, but we also have the simulator that our deputies receive training in. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of use multiple different methods of teaching use of force here. We have classroom portions, because we have to cover the legality of it. Guys have to understand, case law and that kind of thing, as well as our policy. But the best way to learn use of force and everything, and appropriate decision making, because that's really what use of force is be put into situations. So we use two main methods to do that. We have the Virtua V300 simulator, which you mentioned, which is an awesome tool. It's a 300-degree screen. So you step up in a platform and you're surrounded by screens 300 degrees around you. It's very immersive and gives you that perception that you're actually there in that scenario. The other thing that we do is actual live scenarios with live role players. So an instructor or another officer or occasionally members of the public that volunteer, usually family members or something like that, can be utilized as role players.
The other thing I think that is helpful for our personnel to have is the policies that we have to go by. Can you talk about our use of force policy and how that is helpful to our deputies?
So the policy is really just kind of a framework. It gives us a guideline of what we can do and how we operate. So our policy, it cites case law. It lays out the levels of force and kind of when it could be appropriate to use each level of force. It also states in there specific prohibitions on use of force. Certain things that we cannot do by policy that might legally might be allowed, but just they're not allowed by policy. And a lot of them are very common sense driven. You would hear them and be like, well, yeah, of course you shouldn't do that. So it's important that we have that policy there and everything as a guiding document. But really, case law is really what drives a lot of use of force. Graham v. Connor and Tennessee v. Garner are two of the principal cases that law enforcement officers are required to know and understand because they're going to play a big part in when force can be used, what level of force can be used, and what's justified and not justified.
Okay. Now, the policy also lays out what happens if a deputy has to engage in use of force. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because we don't just, if they are forced to use that, there are steps that they have to follow. There's a process they have to follow that is reviewed. Can you, again, go ahead and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Any use of force is taken seriously. So the first two levels of force, officer presence and verbal commands. So a law enforcement officer just showing up, being there in uniform, with a badge on their chest, that is a level of force. That's, there's a certain understanding that person has authority and that kind of thing. Anything really beyond those two, beyond presence and verbal commands, if force is used, whether it's physical control or whether there's some sort of tool from the officer's belt that's utilized, then it's recorded as a use of force. A supervisor must be notified immediately, and essentially an investigation is began. With lesser levels of force, maybe it's simply hands-on, then a lot of times the supervisor kind of sees that investigation the whole way through. If it's a more severe use of force, our detectives become involved, our internal affairs unit becomes involved right from the beginning. But anytime there's force, supervisors is notified immediately. It's recorded in our reporting process. And then also we conduct a use of force review quarterly. So every use of force is kind of pulled from the system, and it's reviewed by a panel and determined whether or not it was justified. And even if it was justified, it's determined is our training adequate? Was it appropriate? Were there things that we could have done better? And if there's things that we could have done better, is that on the individual deputy and the decision they made, or is it a failure somewhere along the line within training? They can also determine that, hey, maybe it wasn't justified and it needs to be investigated further. So there's there's a check and balance there.
How are our deputies notified if there are any changes to that policy?
Our use force policy, just like any other policy that we have, anytime that a change is made to it, an email is sent out to all hands. So everybody gets an email saying, hey, there's been a change to the policy.
I know also during roll call, deputies are provided information on important situations that are occurring, and they also have the opportunity at that time to ask questions about policy changes when they come in for their shift.
Yeah, absolutely. The roll call training is invaluable. I mean, throughout the year, the frontline supervisors, they see deputies more often than anybody. And so issues like that are routinely covered on a day-to-day basis. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind, and I do want to kind of go back and touch on a second, is that de-escalation piece.
Yes.
Because it's that is really what we spend most of our time focusing on training wise, is how to avoid a use of force. And sometimes I think there can be some confusion with that, from a public perspective. And so, for example, what I mean by that is probably one of the best ways we can avoid force is sometimes by a greater show of force preemptively. And what I mean by that is, for example, a routine traffic stop compared to a high risk stop, where we have information that maybe the car was stolen. Maybe it was stolen during a carjacking. The vehicle was just seen leaving the scene of a crime where a weapon was used or something like that. We're going to approach that vehicle much differently than a standard traffic stop that many of the people watching this may have been subject to in the past. We're not going to walk right up to the window and ask for a license and registration. We're going to exit our vehicles. We're going to give commands. And a lot of times we're already going to have our firearms drawn or anything, so that we're prepared to act if the need arises. Maybe there's certain calls that we'll show up and have a canine on scene from the beginning when we first show up. And a lot of times those shows of force, right, that show of force is adequate in then gaining compliance and thereby preventing the need to actually use force. So I think there's a lot of confusion and stuff in some of that, because the public sees that and they see it as a very violent response to something. And in fact, it's not. It's really in everybody's best interest. It's also important to understand in some of those cases, I'll go back to the high risk vehicle stop scenario. Maybe the vehicle was seen leaving the scene of a crime, but it's also very important to understand that we may have had 10 eyewitnesses to this crime, and those 10 eyewitnesses provided us with 6 different descriptions of the vehicle that left. Especially at night, it's very common, depending on lighting, for people to tell us that the vehicle was black, or the vehicle was blue or gray or green. Depending on the way the lighting is and how people see it, we can get a big variance in the description of the vehicle. And so a lot of times innocent people end up kind of getting caught up in the middle of this incident simply because their vehicle matches the description of something or something like that. And we are still going to approach it the same way, because that very well could be the vehicle that just committed this heinous crime that we're responding to or something. And so it's very important for people to understand that. And the easiest way to get through it is to simply comply with the commands that are being given. And we will very quickly sort out that they're not involved and send them back on their way. And I know that's a hard concept to understand if you don't really understand the nature of what we're responding to in the first place. But there's a lot of complexities in this, and like you said, we're really kind of scratching the surface. But it's a very complex topic, and I believe that we have a very supportive community in Stafford, and I think a lot of them trust the sheriff's office and understand that when we take action, it's because we absolutely had to, and so I encourage people to continue demonstrating that trust, and when they do find themselves kind of in the middle of that situation, to comply, let it play out. We'll realize that they're not involved, and everybody will be able to move on safely.
Our citizens, our businesses, they've all been so supportive throughout this whole year so far. We've just seen so many outpourings of just expressions of support. We have individuals, organizations coming to the sheriff's office and bringing us supplies, bringing us food, snacks, or just saying thank you. I know we also recently shared just pictures that some of our younger community members are drawing just to say thanks to our deputies. And it's so nice to know that we have such a strong foundation of support with our citizens here in Stafford.
I agree, and it hasn't just been this year. It's been
ever
since I've started. We've enjoyed the same level of appreciation from the community. So.
You're exactly right. And that wraps up this episode of In the Know with the Stafford SO. Thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful and safe day.
Thank you for listening to In the Know with the Stafford SO. This podcast is produced by members of the Sheriff's Office and is one more way we connect with our community. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Visit our website at staffordsheriff.com for details about our social media channels as well as events where you can meet our staff. Thank you for your support.